Hello and welcome to the Managing Uncertainty podcast. Brian Strasser, CEO here at Bryghtpath, and this is episode 200, our 200th episode over 6 years or so. I think we've been doing the podcast. So joining me today is almost the entire team from Bryghtpath. So I'm going to have everybody go through and introduce themselves briefly, and then we're going to get on with the questions that all of you have submitted as listeners. So we'll start with Bray Wheeler.
Hey, everybody. Bray Wheeler. You've heard me before. Senior consultant here at Bryghtpath.
And Bray, how long have you been here with the team?
5 years now.
All right.
As of this month.
Haley.
Hi, everyone. Haley Olvey. I'm an analyst here at Bryghtpath, and I've been here about 3 months.
And Jamie?
Hi, Jamie Anderson. I also joined Bryghtpath about 3 months ago as a senior consultant on the team.
And last but not least, Lydia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia Harper. I'm the communications specialist, and I've been here for about a year and a half.
So the first question, just to kind of help folks get to know everybody before we get into the questions that listeners and others submitted, I'd like to hear everybody just we're a relatively small organization. I think there's 9 of us total on the team, and we have a few folks that come in from time to time on a contract level around graphic design and some particular writing or projects that we do. But we're a pretty small group. Half of us are here in Minnesota, and we have folks in Idaho, Arizona, and New Jersey currently. But what brought all of you here? And I'll go last. I'll exercise some privilege and I'll go last here. But Bray, how did you wind up here 5 years ago?
So 5 years ago, I had one of those kind of pivotal life moments going on with my youngest child. And it wasn't conducive to working at kind of a big Fortune 100 organization. So needed a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more kind of time and better energy direction. And so Brian and I had been having conversations for probably almost a year before then, around potentially joining Bryghtpath, and kind of stars aligned. And when I was at that moment, you were looking for an additional consultant, and that's kind of how I ended up here. So I haven't looked back.
And Lydia, how about you?
I wasn't really looking for a job at the time. I was about 3 semesters out from graduating with my bachelor's degree and figured I'd start applying for jobs to get some practice interviewing. And I interviewed with you, Brian, and fell in love with the company and got a job offer, and I accepted it. And I'm really happy I did.
Jamie?
I was doing business continuity and disaster recovery at an organizational level for about 18 years for a larger local company. And then earlier this year, they had some restructuring and my position was eliminated as part of that. And so I had worked with both Brian and Bray in a previous life. And so I decided it was a good opportunity to try something new and try my hat at consulting.
And Haley?
I previously worked mainly in the legal industry for private and government entities, but my master's was within Homeland Security and Emergency Management. So business continuity can kind of fall in there with the structuring. And at the time I graduated in 2020, there wasn't really a lot out there that wasn't related to COVID, and I didn't have the experience to help any company with that. So I stayed within law, and then 3 months ago ran across Bryghtpath's analyst position. And same with Lydia. After interviewing, it just felt like the right team for me and the best environment for me to grow within in this business continuity field, and haven't looked back since.
And my history is similar, except this started with me, I guess. I spent 21 years at the same company in a variety of roles, but several years, 6 years, leading business continuity, crisis management, and intelligence globally for a Fortune 30 company. And in 2014, I just hit an interesting nexus in life. I had spent 2 decades at the same place, and that was starting to feel kind of stale. company wasn't going in a direction that I agreed with. My leader had retired that I'd worked for 17 years, and I didn't like my new leader. And I was coming out of business school with an MBA and was like, man, all of my classmates have interesting jobs that are not here. And as someone once said, you're basically unsupervisable, Brian. So maybe you should do your own thing. And so I started Bryghtpath. I quit in May 2014, started Bryghtpath a few weeks later, kind of took the summer off, and then really got going that fall with our first client, and hired our first employee a year and a half later, and the rest is kind of history. Marie was the third employee, Bray was the fourth, and things kind of just went from there pretty quickly to what we are now. So maybe a fun question before we get to the business stuff. In your youth, what did you think you would grow up to be?
I can take it. Lydia here. I wanted to be a professional Olympic snowboarder. Obviously, that didn't work out, but I was still happy with my job now.
Haley here. I always thought I would either be in law enforcement, which I do not have the physical ability to do, or I would be a nail tech. So two very differing paths that my parents just had to run through my childhood with.
That is the best two different job options I've seen yet.
I was going to say, I always thought when I was younger that, I'd be the legit fifth member of the A team at some point. So nice little 80s throwback for folks. Really the one that I guess I talked about the most was becoming an airplane pilot, flying everywhere. I don't know why. I don't have any interest in it now, but when I was younger, that was my career choice.
Yeah, when I was young, I remember wanting to be like a marine biologist so I could just spend my days swimming with dolphins and playing with sea life. But my dad had a job in IT, and so that was more realistic. So I followed that path instead.
My older daughter, Megan, just asked me the other day, she's 12, what I wanted to do when I was 12. And I told her that I really like the ocean and ships. And so I thought I would go to the Naval Academy and become a naval officer, a surface warfare officer. So I wanted to study aerospace engineering because I thought that was cool. And I did absolutely none of those things. But I came from a Navy family with a long multi-generation history of service in the Navy. And so I think that it's kind of weird for a family that's in Indiana, but that's kind of how things evolved. I definitely did none of those things. My younger daughter wants to be a pop star right now, so that's her current focus. Let's get on to the more business questions. One of the first question that we got was about trend and just how have we seen business continuity and crisis management evolve in recent years? What's changed, or what are some trends that we see today? And I guess I'll start with one trend that we've seen. Maybe this is a little too tactical, but the pandemic, I think, definitely awoke a lot of companies to the need to do a better job in this space, to invest more. We've also had more natural disasters on a larger scale in recent years. Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria come to mind. So I think this has spurred a lot of interest. And so the trend that I see is this trend right now, at least, of upward investment and interest from executives and boards around this issue. I think cybersecurity issues have also driven some of this, but I think it's a very positive trend, but that's one of the trends that I see. What do all of you see?
Yeah, I'd say too, in the post-COVID era, the increasing move to a hybrid workforce model, and that's helped to reduce some of the dependence on physical locations and impacts from a site-related disruption standpoint. But with that comes the trade-off of that increased reliance on technology, where the teams are having expanded use of things like communication tools, the virtual meeting platforms, document repositories, things like that. So being able to keep that IT resilience in place and enable that coordination among those hybrid or remote team members. And then two, with that, you have employees using more personal devices, their home networks. And so there's increased potential for security breaches, data privacy concerns. And so a real focus, I think, on security protocols from a company standpoint to address that as well.
I'd say too, to kind of piggyback on that, but more from less technology, but one of the other areas, just from a people standpoint, I think a lot of the conversations we've been having in the last couple of years with, clients, prospective clients, others that are out there, is that positioning of people as more important than they were before, which I think speaks maybe to a little bit of the corporate culture pre-pandemic, but really that emphasis on taking care of people, supporting people, figuring out how to, get them the technology, get them back online, get them available, and just make sure that they're okay, seems to be a pretty common thread in the conversation. I'd say, just kind of broadly speaking, I think the pandemic has certainly expedited a lot of things. And then there's been, as you laid out, other factors in terms of naturally occurring events, cyber events, things like that. But that emphasis on having a consistent crisis management or crisis response process within the organization, even if it's perhaps a little bit smaller and not as multifaceted in terms of, layering in some of the different efficiencies that you can do. But we're getting a lot of conversation around crisis management, a lot of conversation around kind of more recently disaster recovery, which I think speaks to a little bit of what Jamie was talking about from a technical aspect. And then certainly business continuity is sort of floating back into that conversation too, as a lot of organizations, I think, have had that, and they're looking to reevaluate, in the post-pandemic world now, and understand, do we have what we need? Is this built for what we need now? Are we doing the right things? So there's almost a reflection of current capabilities, and then a desire to layer in some of the things in this resiliency space that they may not have had, or they put on the back burner, and there's appetite in the organization to do those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've all brought up some great points. There's two things I think I would emphasize based on what I heard here. One is that this whole idea in business continuity of the facility dependence and you think about all the efforts people have spent over the decades that BC's been around, of thinking about alternate work sites and, temporary workspace and renting space, or contracting with a service provider to bring in trailers and all the different things that we've all had to deal with in the past. A lot of that has just radically changed as technology has evolved. And I think the pandemic, to everyone's point here, really accelerated that change, because you simply don't have to do that anymore in a lot of cases. If you're manufacturing or you're doing other hands-on work, it definitely still have to do that. The logistics business, Amazon is a good example of that. But the other radical change, and I think this is a change we're all still experiencing, Jamie brought this up and Bray, you built on it, is that the way that we work has changed. Part of those trends were happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated all of that to this more distributed and hybrid work environment that we find ourselves in. But it also is where our clients have found themselves in as things have evolved. What are some other challenges or obstacles that we've seen companies run into when they're trying to build these resilience programs, crisis management, business continuity, crisis comms? I mean, we've worked with a lot of clients that have been where we've helped them diagnose what they should do and then help them build those things. What are some obstacles or challenges that they run into?
I think one that we can note pretty consistently is maybe limited employee awareness or training. We see a lot of times where employees aren't being supported by management to give them the tools that they need to be able to understand their continuity plans, to be able to implement that in the event of a disruption. And just having those things that we provide, like exercises, education, and just awareness around that can be something that's hard when management or upper levels aren't pushing for everyone to fully understand what this means within their organization.
I think it's an interesting observation, Haley, in terms of just the general employee population having that understanding of resilience and sort of all the tentacles that build from that. I think that speaks to kind of one of the other challenges, and maybe speaks directly to it, is oftentimes we see the corporate culture itself be a challenge, and not necessarily in a way that they don't want to do something or they're being obstinate in terms of implementing crisis response or business continuity plan or things like that. It's just a matter of the organization itself, the culture, the way they operate, the way they make decisions, the way that they lead or communicate are all things that can challenge effective, crisis management, business continuity, disaster recovery, crisis communications, all the things that, we talk about here. Those are all impacted by, those challenges. And there's not necessarily a wrong way or a right way, for an organization to talk. I think the market sort of dictates that a little bit. In general, that corporate culture really has the biggest influence on how successful a lot of these programs become, because they need to be adopted, they need to be cared for, they need to be embraced, to Haley's point. And I think that piece of undereducating, undertraining, plus variance in the corporate cultures can create a lot of challenges or obstacles for moving these programs forward effectively.
And I think along with that too, that leadership support and commitment, that's so important to drive that culture. Making sure that the leaders are committed to the business continuity and crisis management programs, that they're endorsing it, they're actively involved. Without that support, it can be really challenging to have the necessary resources, get funding, and get that buy-in that you need to have the successful program.
Yeah, kind of building on what everybody's been saying, is a really significant challenge is that the crisis leader just doesn't make themselves important. It doesn't make their program important. And it's really hard to be able to align the program with the organization, with the culture of the organization, if you don't have a crisis leader that's pushing for that.
I think that's a great point that Lydia brings up, is not making themselves as important. And that can lead to even incomplete risk assessments, to where the company doesn't even know exactly what they need. And that's, of course, where a company like us, Bryghtpath, can step in and help. But they could struggle with conducting even comprehensive risk assessments due to just lack of expertise or data. And that almost sets them a step behind, even knowing what they need from a company like us. And of course, we can come in and help them and use our expertise to give them that stance on what they need for their organization. But if they don't seek help, they're just immediately behind.
I think one of the other pieces too that often comes into play is that whether it's sort of a leader who's experienced effective crisis management or business continuity in a previous organization, that they come in and they're championing this effort, or they've sort of embraced it, or somebody's read something or learned about it and they want to put these programs into place. I think oftentimes what ends up happening is these programs become a boil the ocean exercise from the start, where everybody's trying to do everything all at once with anything that, and we've talked about this in different iterations in our content, but that crawl, walk, run idea of start with what is it that the organization truly needs to meet the current risk or issue, whether that's a compliance or regulatory or just some baseline fundamental operations, sort of that basic blocking and tackling, and start there and then build from there. So as you learn more, as you gain champions in the organization, as you use these things, it becomes a lot easier to then, sell some of this stuff as you progress, the program. And I think a lot of times, these programs put themselves 2 steps behind by trying to do a lot of different things all at once and not giving themselves the opportunity to sort of mature organically, and then being able to seize opportunities when they do arise.
Well, I think I used to talk about, I think it's a great point, Bray. I think I used to talk about, when you're when you're running a program, you have to protect home plate first. And by that, I mean, and I'm using a baseball metaphor here about the catcher, but what I mean by that is before you can go out and do all of these other things, you have to execute on the basic blocking and tackling the program requires. And then you have that opportunity to build on that credibility you've established and do more. But you got to do the thing first.
Yep.
And execute well on that before you can start layering on all of this other stuff. So let's think about some success stories. But what are some, obviously we can't name clients here, but what are some success stories about where we've seen organizations or we've helped organizations really effectively navigate through a crisis through their programs? And I think I'll start with just one from the pandemic. One of our clients we worked with for several years, a technology company, they had a very well constructed business continuity and crisis management program that we built with them, and we still execute for them on a managed service basis. But in the pandemic, their execution in the early days of the pandemic, I thought was pretty flawless. They used their crisis management team. They used their executive team to meet. They met daily. Actually, they met twice a day for a while with the executives during the pandemic, and they made some big strategic decisions early. One of those decisions was, as they're the big presence in India, they were watching the data of what was going on in India. They asked us to assess how well is India going to respond to this from a governmental perspective. And I think, Bray, your assessment was it's going to be a mess.
Mm-hmm.
India was not going to have the ability as a country to respond to this quickly. And they quickly shifted to a work from home model in India, not just with their own folks, but they went to their main service provider, which employs thousands of people on their behalf in India, and said, you need to be ready to go work from home. And to do that, we're going to buy all of these Wi-Fi hotspots and laptops that they didn't own today so that they could do that. They made that decision in about 48 to 72 hours from the moment it came up to making and implementing the decision and all the legal agreement changes they needed to do. And then they went and basically cornered the market on this gear in Asia to the point where you, like a month later, you couldn't buy webcams or laptops or anything else. But because they had a process, they executed on this early and were the first mover on this.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was brilliantly done by their leadership team.
I was just going to add color to it. I mean, we even heard that from other organizations that we've just talked to in different capacities, where they had mentioned, man, at the start of COVID, we really struggled to get laptops and hotspots. We couldn't find any. And I think we just all kind of chuckled and said, well, we know where they went. It went to that client that made that decision early on. And to your point, cornered the market on it. From other success stories, that we've seen, and, this one is still probably, it's a current client still, but, there was a lot of opportunity and a lot of desire within the organization to have an effective response program. Oftentimes responses were run kind of in different portions of the organization, all of which were trying to do, sort of the right thing and not necessarily bother other people and trying to solve the problem. Sort of a Midwest US company. So, don't want to bother anybody, want to kind of solve the problem on our own. It'll be okay. We don't want to inconvenience anybody. But I think within that culture, there was a strong desire to have something that was much more cross-functional and from both leadership down. And even though the leadership probably maybe had some mixed feelings about what that might look like and how effective that might be, I think one of the things that we've seen with them as they've continued to mature is earlier on, this was even, I think, after the first tabletop exercise. So they practiced kind of once, but they had a couple of real life issues happen that required them to implement the crisis response program and activate their team and work through the process. And as to be expected, obviously not perfect out of the gate, a little bit clunky, but at the same time was far more effective than what they had done before. And even though some of the missteps they had, one of which was just communication back to leadership with clarity and consistency so that executives knew what was going on, knew how to answer questions, knew where sort of the process was. What we heard in the feedback, or what we heard from our contact in the organization we were working for, was we were coming in to do a training, and they thought that this conversation would be sort of a indictment on the process and what was happening and how it was ineffective and it was clunky and it was bad communication. And what we ended up hearing in the actual conversation with executives was this process worked really great. However, how are we communicating to us? What does that look like? What are the expectations of us, of the team? What should we expect when we get into these situations so that we know what to do, who to look for, how to respond or not respond? So it was sort of eye-opening, I think, for some of the folks that are part of that process to hear that embracement of the process and the program with some very direct and important feedback and valid feedback that allowed them to pivot and make changes. And so in subsequent exercises, they've really pushed on that factor of trying to deliver consistent communication, making sure that those things are aligned. It's kind of a long-winded story, but it speaks to some of the complexities that come into place with some of these programs, but success, even in failure of maybe not doing it right, is still success, and it's still progress, and it's that iterative growth that builds it into the culture, that builds its maturity, that builds its confidence of the participants and the leadership.
One thing that we hear a lot about, we just talked with some folks about this yesterday, was about ineffective exercises, ineffective crisis and continuity exercises, and how leaders have really struggled to gain traction with exercises. And I'm just curious, maybe Bray, this is really in your wheelhouse, but what do we see out there, and what, what's our advice? What have we recommended doing differently than what usually comes up?
I think some of the common themes that we hear, with exercises, especially kind of internal exercises that organizations are running themselves, are it's very time consuming. We're competing for time with the team or our executives or both. They're not realistic. They're too simple. We want sort of all these crazy things, but we don't really want any crazy things happening in the exercise. So it's sort of a mixed bag, because oftentimes the fundamental piece within there is there's not an actual programmatic approach to running an exercise or running exercises. So as we lay out in different things, there's some fundamental differences between the different types of an exercise that a corporation can run. Tornado drills, for especially those in the Great Plains and the Midwest of the US, are important, and they happen all the time, once a month, especially here in Minnesota. First Wednesday of the month at 1:00, tornado sirens are going off to test those things, and schools and hospitals and other businesses take advantage of those to practice that, or a fire drill, or unfortunately now what's becoming active assailant training within schools and religious institutions and hospitals and things like that. But all of those things are drills, but those things can manifest in specific parts of the organization. But having an understanding of what exercises are and what they're meant to do is really, really important for an organization, and it solves a lot of those problems. I mean, I could go on and on about this, but I think those inefficiencies that people sort of commonly state to us sort of over and over, and I can almost probably guess which one they're going to say based on what we understand of the organization, to that point, they really don't have a proper fundamental approach to it. Like, what is the intent? What are the objectives of running that exercise? And it gets back a little bit to that crawl, walk, run. A lot of times they want to do the surprise, kick the door open, hey, executive leadership, we just had this crazy thing happen, and what are you going to do? That's not realistic. That's probably not how those things are going to develop. You have to practice like you're going to play and how you're going to actually respond. And that's really important for building that muscle memory and driving towards, again, those programmatic objectives, organizational objectives. But having that approach and a consistent approach matters in exercises. And they don't have to be complex. They don't have to take lots of time. They just have to be scoped correctly with the right objectives. And you're going to get valuable insights and areas that you can improve upon during a 60-minute tabletop conversation around something where you're just talking about what it is that you would do.
Right. I think, like you mentioned, having that clear objective is so important, and making sure that the exercise is going to test the specific recovery strategies that you're looking to test as a part of it, avoiding those black swan type scenarios where the sky is falling. And that really leads for, I think, participants start spiraling, they start going off on tangents, and even, questioning the reality of the scenario. And having that clear objective, having the clear objective really helps to make sure that you get those lessons learned specific to the recovery strategies, and that you can enhance your plan based on the results of the exercise.
Well, I think we see too where, like there's just a lot of really poorly constructed exercises, right? Like I was just at a client site down in Texas a couple of weeks ago, and one of the senior leaders I was talking to said that she described the crisis exercise that she had been to in a previous role around that it was like the Kobayashi Maru exercise from Star Trek, where it was a no-win scenario. There was no possible way that the company could have a good experience in the exercise. And it also was a confluence of events that was so far-fetched, it was the ultimate black swan. Exercises, particularly when you're starting, they have to be realistic. They've got to be realistically scoped to an actual problem that's going to resonate with the participants. Otherwise, it's crazy.
Yep.
And we also see, and I want to bring this up because it's something we run into all the time, is crisis exercises or even continuity exercises. They will not be successful if your goal is to let people fail.
Correct.
Is that you're trying to get people to fail. This comes up a lot where, we get approached by a prospective client about doing an exercise. And one of our questions in the sales process is, what plan do you have in place for this today? And a lot of times we hear, well, we don't have a plan. We want to use the exercise to force them to understand that they have to have a plan. I'm like, all this is going to do is piss people off. You need a plan that the team is trained to, and then you can practice to the plan. If you don't have a plan, you were just setting everyone up for 2 to 3 hours of frustration and your credibility taken, going into the crapper. It's just not a good place to start. You need to have a plan in place to have an effective exercise.
And even within the exercises, ending on a note that, we often end a lot of our exercises from a recovery standpoint. So that shift from, this is more on the crisis side than a continuity exercise. But within that crisis exercise, that response probably takes up the majority of the time, but we often guide them or position the scenario in a way that they're going to arrive at a certain point, or we do an artificial time jump to get there. But we end in that recovery portion because, one, it's important to talk about that recovery. So response is actively fighting, sort of the issue hand to hand. Recovery is really about the fight's over and how are we getting ourselves back to normal. And ending that conversation in that way sort of allows for that feeling of, hey, we learned a lot, even if it didn't feel good, but look, we survived it. what are those things that we need to think about as an organization at this point? And how do we kind of pick ourselves back up and dust ourselves off and get ourselves back operating? And that really becomes that kind of positive moment out of a really intense, 60 to 90 to, couple day exercise, to really get them in a state of mind that's not negative walking out of the exercise. There could certainly be a lot of opportunities that they've discovered, but knowing that they've survived and shifted in that recovery is really important.
Part of what we see a lot, right, is that there's a role for leaders, senior leaders in particular, to play around ensuring that companies have a successful resilience program. What are some things we've seen around this, good and bad, that come into play?
I think there's been I think several clients that we've worked with, and just even experience with our own experience within organizations, that competing desire for control during a response is human, it's organic, it's going to happen because there's a lot of things that are out of a lot of people's control. And so people want to embrace as much as they can in terms of solving the problem. But I think particularly for executive leadership, and even leadership over these programs, is to be as supportive as possible, make sure you're as aware as possible, but then sort of get out of the way and let the program that you've blessed and the people that you've empowered to do these things work the problem, and help understand where objectives may need to be course corrected, where resources may need to be reallocated, but really step out of the way of the active kind of response and shift into the more strategic elements, continuing to operate the portions of the business that are still available, and making sure that those aren't being tripped up by what's happening, so that you don't have secondary, crises or issues that pop up. But that becomes really important, is having that confidence in the program and the people, and knowing when to step out of the way.
We've written before, I think we have a couple articles about the role of a champion in a program, right? And I do think that there's a two-way street here when it comes to leadership. You have to have a credible program leader in order to garner leadership support. But on the other end of the equation, you need a leadership team that sets the tone, that sets the expectation, that sets the importance of the program. And you need both of those things to be in sync. I think one of the challenges that's been raised over the last couple of years with, coming out of the pandemic, where there's more focus on this, is that some of the, like, if you're running a resilience program and you're more comfortable hanging out in your cubicle looking at spreadsheets than you are in driving and marketing and talking about the program in the C-suite, then you're never going to get the resources or the capabilities or the tools or the investment in your program that you really need. You've got to be a leader that's aligned with the business and be able to speak that language in order to advance business continuity and crisis management and DR and all the things that make up a good resilience program. You can't just hide, in your cubicle. I hate to stereotype, but there's a lot of people in this industry that's what they do. That's how they think of what they do.
Well, and it's all the more important now, as we talked about in some of the other questions that folks have asked, is in this post-COVID world, in this hybrid model, it's even more important to do those things, because you don't have the opportunities to just walk to different floors, walk to different offices, be physically present with these other people to have these conversations. It's all the more important to drive those narratives, drive the importance of the program and what that program can do in this kind of hybrid world right now.
We talk a lot about alignment of a resilience program to a company's strategic objectives, their organizational objectives. Where do we see companies really struggle with this?
That's a great question. I think it gets back to some of the pieces that we've sort of talked around or danced around, is that alignment to the strategic objectives of the organization really means, one, being out there and understanding how that manifests with different leaders, different teams, different functions in the organization, what their needs are to meet those things. Building partnerships with other teams like enterprise risk management or audit or compliance regulatory, or just even the strategy teams that exist within organizations to really understand what those things mean and how they're supposed to show up. And in the future, how does the organization need to be resilient once those things are evolved or achieved? Those pieces, they're really easy to go down a rabbit hole, but they're also very important from a championing perspective and just from a program perspective to have on the forefront, because those trickle down into what are those programs or teams or departments or however you define it in your organization. What are their objectives? What are they trying to achieve? What's critical to them? It allows sort of the common language, common conversation that's happening there. And a lot of times it's kind of a harder conversation to have because it can sometimes mean different things to different people depending on how familiar they are with it. But ignoring it makes you way off track or puts you in a position of trying to put resources to something that may not be needed, or resourcing in the wrong parts of the program that may need less resourcing, depending on what those objectives are. So understanding what your company is about as critical to the success of a program as anything else. And those objectives really drive that.
Yeah, I mean, I just see a lot, and I think we just see a lot where the BC program or the crisis program or both have really like the leaders and the way the program is structured has no alignment to the way what the organization is focused on and how the organization expects to grow and change in time. And in my mind, not only do you have to be aligned in the way that you just described, Bray, you also have to be thinking about where's the company going.
Yep.
Right. So, for example, we talked about hybrid and distributed work environments. If that's where your company is going, then you've got to align to that direction, or you're just asking for trouble. You will not be prepared when the time comes for the next shift in your organization.
Yeah, I mean, it can manifest in simple questions like, in our BIA, how, and Jamie and Haley can speak to this too, but, how much emphasis do we put in facilities and locations in a BIA or the BC plan if our organization is really shifting to a very hybrid-esque model, or even just a pure remote from work? Are those questions we even spend lots of time on, or do we reframe the question to just drive to the answer that we need to get and then spend the time where we do need to spend it?
I think that's a great point that Bray's making of driving our answers. And that's something we can see a lot when we're updating business continuity plans is, are you guys still using this location? And when they say no, we don't just stop there and go, okay, and move on. We say, okay, well, how many are hybrid? How many people are completely remote now that aren't at the location? We just need to get those answers to have the most in-depth view that we can. And sometimes that takes people like us, an analyst, a consultant, to be able to help probe those answers to get to where we need for that plan to be effective.
As companies think about bringing in a company like Bryghtpath, what point do we think it's valuable for them to look at bringing us in? But at what level of maturity, or at what point in their program time frame do we think it's valuable for companies to pursue help like from Bryghtpath or a competitor?
My fundamental answer is maybe not necessarily bringing in a consultant, but continuity, response management, crisis communications, all those things should be at the forefront no matter how big you are. And we've certainly had clients that are on the smaller end that are looking for very direct things, or we've had people that have purchased some of the products that we have available that kind of guide them to those solutions. So I think no matter what size you are, it's important to think about those things. I think from where consulting organization or group can come in and provide the most value is when you're on a trajectory of intense growth if you're smaller. If you're a mid to large size organization, you often have a lot of organic complexity, but you probably have a lot of operational complexity. Or you're in a business that is considered within perhaps critical infrastructure, or in a space that has a lot of different dynamics that aren't as apparent or organic. Consultants can really help come in and, particularly for us, our approach is really making these models fit within the culture and the organization. But I think there are lots of different reasons that organizations can reach out. But I think for those that don't have something in place, there's a lot of value in having an outside team come in and design something, especially, tooting our own horns here because it's our podcast, but one that's going to come in, and our desire is not to have it sit on a shelf, and really drive that process into the culture of the organization. For organizations that have these things, but you feel like the programs aren't maturing, they're not making progress, you're not sure what you're missing. Bringing in a consultant, even just to have a conversation or do an evaluation of where you're at, provides lots of valuable insight and is a good sort of pause and reflect moment to then be able to position the program or the team or the resources in a different way that, even though you have all the data that you could possibly need based on current process, really helps drive that in a more effective, efficient way than sort of the team that's invested in it on the ground is seeing real time.
I think Bray has a great point of sometimes when an organization doesn't know why their program isn't gaining the traction or isn't getting where they need it to. It's one of my favorite quotes of, "You don't know what you don't know." They need that outside influence to be able to just help educate them. And that's something that our team is very good at, is giving that knowledge and resource that they need to where at some point they can be independent and their organization can run this if they want to, but they need that head start. They need that kickoff, and they need just our expertise on it because they don't know where to start or they don't know what they're missing.
And I think, I think these are all great points. There's not always, not every company is going to be the ideal client for something like this, whether it's us or a competitor. You have to be in a certain place. And I don't think that place has anything to do with where your program is, because I think that consultants can add value whether you're building something from scratch, like you're interested in rapidly establishing the program, or you're taking something you have and you want to mature it, you want to add to it, you want to make it more complete. But I think you have to be in a certain place as an organization where you're willing to take that advice and you're willing to let the team, whether it's us or Deloitte or PwC or Ernst & Young, one of the companies we compete with, you have to let them have unfettered access to documentation, to stakeholders, to the executives, to understand where things are at. You have to let the consultant accurately diagnose what's going on and propose to you the best solutions that can lead to real change, and in a way that minimizes disruption during implementation or an actual crisis as possible. And it requires that you, as the client, be strongly engaged from the start. You've got to listen, you've got to ask questions, you have to read with focus. And as your experts, us, hopefully, suggest and help you implement changes, that you drive the team into action and that you're willing to really strongly advocate for what needs to be done internally. To have those teams, I think, have the best success rate. But you've got to be in a place where you're open to a different perspective from experts, right? The advantage of bringing in an outside advisor like us is that we have seen this. We have pretty much been there, done that for companies in all different industries, in all different geographies, with all different kinds of problems. And we've got a different take on how to do this. And we are also, your outside expert is also just completely divorced from your internal politics. It's not that we don't understand that there are politics and that we don't know how to navigate them, because we do, but I'm not beholden to them, right? We expect to do the work and we have to approach that work as if we're never going to be there again. So you get a level of candor, or as we say, empathetic directness, I think, right? Or we are empathetically direct. We're not going to water down our opinion because we're looking for the next thing. We're going to give you our honest take about what needs to be done. And then if you want, we're going to help you do that thing. And clients that have the best success are ones that understand that, and they're willing to let us present and defend our work and not let it get watered down in the process. One reader question that we had too is about documentation. I thought this was a really interesting question. The way that he put it in our private Facebook group where we asked the question was, I understand that the ISO standards are all about documentation and records and a manual and, you know, the details of having written documentation. In our opinion, how many types of documentation does an overall BC program or BC plan have to have in a typical organization? Should I think about doing this as like an all-in-one manual, or should I have policy, guidance, playbook, and others in separate documentation? How would we recommend that they approach that?
I think from a kind of overall programmatic perspective, and I'll leave the nuances of BCM to others here, but from an overall program perspective, really having documents that are laid out in that fashion of starting with a really strong and direct policy is often our preferred approach when we're outlining these things for organizations, and just our methodology, and then building from there. It manifests a little bit different from organization to organization, depending on how they've sort of set up some of their, documentation around different things. But for the most part, that strong policy to start then outlines where you go as a framework and an overall plan. And that overall plan does not have to be 90 pages long or 1,000 pages long or a 3-inch binder of material. I think we really look at this as you're adding the pieces to the program that are necessary to make the program effective, useful, usable, and accessible to the people that are in the program or that would need to use the materials, and approaching it from that way. We've done a lot of different things for a lot of these different types of materials, but that strong policy into a framework and a plan that outlines the program and the components of the program and the roles and responsibilities and all that, all those details that, ISO does a fantastic job of dryly laying out. But then getting it into what are those other supplementary or collateral material that really helps support those things, that allows the plan to just kind of guide the overall programmatic approach. But when you get into a situation or you need to, bust out your BC plan, that you're just pulling out the material that it is that you need, not the whole compendium of things. And I think our methodology is to definitely have all of the documentation, but not necessarily composited together that makes it unreadable to the user. When we do crisis management things, really people have access to the policy and the plan and framework and all that kind of stuff. But really the thing that we drive home with them over and over again is the material that relates to their part of a response. They need to understand all those other things, but just access the piece and use the piece like a response checklist or a guide that you've developed. That's the piece that you should be going to consistently. And that's, I think, where the most growth happens is, again, making it accessible across the board, but having all those different right components to it as well.
Yeah, I think, at least from a program level, we have never argued that you should put all this in one document. We almost always break this out in more of a modular way. Like policy is policy. A framework or a set of SOPs is another thing. The plan is another. Playbooks may be separate and act as appendixes. I think you just got to figure out the best approach for your organization. But I don't like putting all of that into one document, but that's probably more of a personal preference than anything else. The thing about the ISO standard is it's not directive in that way. It sets that you should do these things. You should have this documentation. It's not prescriptive in how you do that, just that you need to have it and here's what should be in it.
Yep.
So you could have an 800-page document and have all of your, 95 business continuity plans in there. I just wouldn't recommend that from a usability standpoint.
Yeah, I think we more so look at it as those ISO standards as more of a checklist of things that need to be in there versus a prescriptive template of how it should look.
Mm-hmm.
Because to your point, the ISO standards do not do that, but they are a very valuable checklist to be able to check off, yes, we've done this and this and this. Perhaps there's portions that don't apply or that you've chosen not to do. Then you're able to speak to those saying, we're not doing these portions for these reasons. And that creates a really valuable conversation, but also builds confidence, whether that's with your audit team or your leaders or whomever, in terms of why choices were made or not made. It's grounded in something, but we've developed it for our organization.
Okay, so last kind of BC related question before we get to the fun stuff. What else have we seen? We've talked about a few things, but what else have we seen change with resilience since the pandemic? What does the 2023 world of resilience look like that's different than, say, the 2019 world of resilience?
I think the desire to exercise is definitely greater than what we saw or felt pre-19. And maybe that's perhaps a little just perception bias, but I think at the same time, we are seeing a lot of requests for exercising, even without sort of other components of the program, because that organization may have that, but they're really looking for, hey, how do we get better or faster, or what other pieces can we think about from an exercising standpoint that is really going to drive value, because our leaders want it, our teams want it, our third parties may want it, our program may want it, kind of whomever, but that appetite, even within the organization, I think is much broader than what we've seen in the past.
I think it's more dynamic than in the past, where we're having growth and change and renewed focus on continuity importance, and pairing that with risk. And it's not kind of the standard pre-COVID of workplace recovery and people recovery. There's just a greater emphasis on the different events and growth that's happening, and making sure that companies are nimble and able to respond and keep operations going, whatever the case may be, whatever the situation may come up.
Yeah, I mean, like we said before, I think there's more leadership and board interest in resilience since the pandemic. I think I think there's a confluence of three things that's happened. The pandemic scared a lot of organizations from a resilience standpoint. They found themselves kind of ad hocing their way through a crisis, or they found that what they had in their business continuity program wasn't adequate to the task. Second, I think this continued increase in cybersecurity, data breach kind of incidents, particularly ransomware or other cyber extortion, has driven a lot of interest from boards. It's also driven more regulatory interest that has, we're seeing requirements coming in now from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission that's changing how we think about cybersecurity regulation, representation on boards, what companies are going to have to disclose. That wasn't really there before. And I think this increase in certain natural disasters that are more driven by climate change, like major hurricanes, and the incidents we saw with that in the U.S. In 2017 and other parts of the world from a typhoon standpoint, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, and the typhoons in Asia. This has all led to this confluence of where companies are really focusing in this space in a way that they haven't before. I think that's great for our industry in terms of more investment, more attention, more of a voice in the C-suite. I think it's a challenge for us from the standpoint of making sure that our program leaders are able to operate at that level, and that they're prepared to have more focus on their program, more focus on them, and more emphasis on whether or not they can lead in that C-suite level. I think the table is set for resilience leaders to have an amazing next decade or two in their careers, but I also think a lot of them are not ready for that. And that's a challenge for our profession, I think.
Yeah, I think that to kind of build on what you're both saying, I think perhaps at a more granular level, excuse me, I'm fighting a cold too, if people haven't picked up on that. From a granular level, I think the incident sets that defined business continuity, crisis management, crisis communications, pre-COVID, pre-ransomware, pre-climate crisis are very different. And so a lot of programs are designed against an incident set that probably isn't the incident set that these programs need to be aligned to or more aligned to going forward. I think there's always certain things that are evergreen, flooding, fire, those types of things. But I think from a challenge standpoint, issue standpoint, or current standpoint, it's starting to evolve and it's looking very different, or different incidents are becoming more important in terms of their occurrence or impact to organizations. And it's just pivoting to that different incident set, or being able to pivot and learn and grow with those incidents are going to, Brian, to your point, I think is going to be very, very, very important for program leaders and experts in this field going forward.
All right, closing thought before we get to one fun question. What are the next? So this is our 200th episode. What do the next 200 episodes look like? What do we think the future looks like here in terms of the podcast?
Ooh, I definitely think we should do more of these. Certainly, as somebody who's done them with you, Brian, I think more team engagement, more broad team engagement in these, I think is going to be a lot of fun and a lot of different perspectives and pretty interesting. I think we're probably going to get some really good content over the next couple of years, just in terms of diversity of challenges and all those sorts of things. But I think we have a lot of cool stuff happening internally that is going to provide a lot of fodder for us to talk about too.
As someone newer, I see kind of what Bray's talking about with our internal growth, changing a bit of the dynamic on what we all bring to the table. So that diversity that we bring of new and experienced and different levels of experience in different fields. So being able for all of us to contribute, to share with others our perspectives on business continuity, crisis management, and all of those things from our growing Bryghtpath team.
Yeah, I think there's going to be plenty of disruptions to come to talk about on the next 200 episodes. And we'll have to try to do more of these. I thought this was a lot of fun. We've done a couple. I mean, Bray and I have done several episodes together when he's been in the office. We've done a couple roundtables a few years ago with the team, but we always did them in the office. And I think that we can look at, doing more of this remotely like we did here, because this was a lot of fun to go through as a group. We're going to wrap up with something fun, which is a little bit of a food fight. We're going to have everybody talk briefly about their top 2 or 3 barbecue sides. And just to clarify, when we say barbecue, we're talking about actual barbecue, like brisket, pulled pork, ribs, fried fish, traditional barbecue, not just cooking on a grill. So who wants to throw out their favorite barbecue sides to start?
Well, I'd say my number one has got to be a really good mac and cheese, preferably a baked one. And then my other one would be corn on the cob.
This is why I was running to my unmute button fast, because I knew Lydia was going to have mine and I was trying to say them first. I love anything. It doesn't have to be corn on the cob. I just love corn, like creamed corn on the cob, or even like a cornbread, but also mac and cheese is definitely my number one.
Cream corn. I thought we were friends, Haley.
Yeah, what the
But-
heck?
Um,
Corn at a barbecue? No way.
Just cream corn in general. Ooh. I mean, for me, I start with a good potato of some kind. I'm a good Midwest New England boy, so you gotta throw some kind of starch in there. I'd also say cornbread of some kind is always a favorite of mine. And then I would say, yeah, I'm kind of in the camp with some of the more, probably pop culture ones, like the good mac and cheese, the good corn on the cob, those sorts of. I don't really get into the beans or the coleslaw or anything like that, but
I think you guys hit on all the good ones. I definitely love a good mac and cheese and cornbread. I'd add the mashed potatoes and gravy, a potato salad, but no spice. I like my things mild.
Good Minnesota girl.
Yep.
I'm just gonna say good sauce, good barbecue sauces of some kind of variety.
Yeah.
They're
I
not
like
really
a sweet-
sides, but
God, it's
Yeah.
got to be a vinegar-based sauce, or I'm not interested.
I like the sweet honey sauces.
That's good. Actually, my favorite barbecue sauce is going to be like a dry rub, like Salt Lick down in Austin, Texas. You can buy their dry rub on Amazon, and it gets multiple uses every week in my house. It's great on chicken, pork, or what have you. Okay, so I've got something different. Like my favorite barbecue side is collard greens, preferably with like smoked ham or bacon mixed in there. But collard greens, I like cornbread, jalapeno cornbread in a cast iron skillet is the best, in my opinion. And I like a potato salad. It's got to be a German potato salad, like so heavy on the mustard. And you can throw in peas or whatever else kind of floats your boat. But good mix of potato and onion and a mustard base is what kind of rocks my world with barbecue. Shouldn't have recorded this right before lunch because now it just makes me hungry.
I know this is a terrible topic to end a call with right before lunchtime.
Well,
There
thanks.
wasn't much of a food fight either.
No, we didn't have that much.
There's a lot of
disagreement,
general
did we?
agreement.
Yeah. Well, it's all in what everybody likes. I think that's kind of the story when it comes to sides. It's why when you do a big barbecue or a big cookout, you have lots of sides, so you got something for everybody. So
Yep.
And a lot of these are easy to make. So all right, well, that's it for this edition of the Managing Uncertainty podcast. Thanks for all of your support over the last 6 years. Hope you enjoyed this little different take for episode 200. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Be well.